Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Kitabul Adaahi. Adaahi, the plural of udhiyah, it is the animal from the Bahimatul An'am which is sacrificed on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, that is the day of Eid, and it can also be sacrificed during the Ayyamut Tashriq, 11th, 12th and 13th. And it is sacrificed as an act of ibadah to Allah Jalla wa Ala. It is called udhiyah because it is sacrificed on the Eidul Adha. According to the majority of the scholars, it is a sunnah mu'akkada, and according to others, it is wajib. Let us take this first hadith about the proper time of sacrifice. From Jundub ibn Sufyan radiallahu anhu, he says, I was with the Prophet on the Eidul Adha, and the Prophet, before he had finished the prayer, saw a sacrificed sheep. And to this the Prophet commented, Man dhabaha qabla as-salah falyadhbah shatan makanaha, wa man lam yakun dhabaha falyadhbah ala ismillah. Whoever sacrificed before the salah, then he must sacrifice another sheep in lieu of the sheep which he sacrificed before the salah. And whoever has not yet sacrificed should do so by reciting the name of Allah. There are some conditions for the sacrifice to be correct. The first condition is that it must be from the Bahimatul An'am, from the family of the camel, cow or sheep. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, لِيَذْكُرُوا اسْمَ اللَّهِ عَلَى مَا رَزَقَهُمْ مِنْ بَهِيمَةِ الْأَنْعَامِ, that they may make mention of the name of Allah upon what He has provided them from the Bahimatul An'am. That is, you sacrifice in the name of Allah, not just any animal, but an animal from the Bahimatul An'am. That's what the Quran tells us in Surah Al-Hajj. When you perform an act of ibadah, it must agree with the sunnah in 6 aspects. Let's make mention of them. As-sabab, the cause. That is to say, what is causing you to do what you are doing. For example, when you sneeze, you say Alhamdulillah. What causes you to do that? The sneeze. And we have evidence for that. But do you say the same thing when you relieve yourself, making an analogy with sneezing? The answer is no, because there's no evidence for the sabab. That is, when you relieve yourself in the toilet, there's no evidence that you say Alhamdulillah. But there is evidence when you sneeze that you say Alhamdulillah. So you need to have evidence for the sabab. Secondly, al-jins, the type. So this applies here in this hadith. The type of animal must be what the sunnah dictates. So you cannot sacrifice a different type of animal, such as, for example, a horse or a chicken or an ostrich or a rabbit or something of that. So they are not the Bahimatul An'am, so the jins needs to be the same. And then thirdly, the qadr, the amount. So if you're making dhikr of Allah Jalla wa Ala, the amount that the Prophet made is the amount of dhikr that you make. You are not allowed to change the amount and pass it off as the sunnah, or the amount of zakah that needs to be paid. And for example, you're not allowed to change the amount of raka'at in the salah. Fourthly, the hay'ah, the appearance of the action. So if you perform the salah or the hajj, the way you do it, the methodology, the appearance, the outward look needs to be the same as how the Prophet did it. So you cannot, for example, make tawaf of the house going in a clockwise direction. No, this is the wrong hay'ah, the wrong image or appearance. It has to be anti-clockwise. Fifthly, az-zaman, the action needs to be done in the proper time. And this also applies to this hadith. The dhabihah needs to be carried out after the salah. Before the salah is no good. Likewise, stoning the jamrah during the ayyamut tashriq needs to be after the zawal, not before. And then sixthly, the makan, which is the place. So you need to perform this action in the proper place. So you're not allowed to, for example, perform your salah in a graveyard or in the toilet, because this is not the proper place, and you have not been following the sunnah if you did this. So there are 6 matters to consider: sabab, jins, qadr, hay'ah, zaman, makan. Okay, so the second condition for the dhabihah is that after you have chosen the correct animal, it must be of the proper age. It needs to be a musinna, that which has its teeth growing, the front teeth. For a camel this is 5 years, for a cow it is 2 years, for a goat it is 1 year. The third condition, that this animal needs to be properly healthy. It must not be a one-eyed animal, and it must not be an animal which is crippled, which is obviously limping, and it must not be an ill animal which is obviously plainly ill. As for lightly ill, that does not harm. And it must not be an animal with a broken leg with no marrow in its bone, so it is emaciated. These types of animals are not healthy. And any animal which has a worse condition than that which we have mentioned is not allowed to be sacrificed a fortiori. What about an animal who has a leg which is paralyzed? Well, this is just like an animal who does not have that leg, because what use is a paralyzed leg? So again, This is worse than having a limp on a leg, so it will not suffice. As for an emaciated animal, then if it is emaciated, but it still has the marrow of its bone, then this is fine to be slaughtered. As for if it is so emaciated that it does not have a marrow in its bone, then that is not fine to be slaughtered. And then you can find many other types of defects, which are small types of defects. For example, its ear cut off. A defect like that does not harm, and you can sacrifice this type of animal. Also, the horn being cut off, or maybe the tail being cut off, these types of defects, even if they are defects, and better not to sacrifice such animals, because you're giving it for Allah Jalla wa Ala. What you give to Allah needs to be quality, not the type of wealth that you were going to throw away anyway, so you may as well throw it towards Allah. Nonetheless, we say it would suffice as a sacrifice. And then we have the fourth condition, the correct timing. This is what this hadith speaks about. It must be on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, or on the Ayyam al-Tashriq, after the Salah. As far as the Ayyam al-Tashriq, it needs to be before the sunset of the 13th, because at the sunset the new day begins. You can sacrifice it after its proper time period if you had a valid excuse. For example, if you have an animal that you want to sacrifice for the Udhiyah, but it runs away from you, and you do not find it until after the Ayyam al-Tashriq, and there was no fault on your part that it ran away. So here you can offer the qada, or to make up for this action, and offer the sacrifice even if it is after the Ayyam al-Tashriq. It's similar to making up for your prayer after you miss the time because of forgetfulness or sleep. Question: do you offer the sacrifice in order to eat its meat? The answer is no, this is not the ultimate goal of the sacrifice. The ultimate goal of the sacrifice is an act of ibadah to Allah Jalla wa Ala. Yes, it is true you can eat the meat, but you're not sacrificing to eat the meat. Rather, you're sacrificing as an act of ibadah, so note the difference. That's completely different to, for example, sacrificing a chicken in order to eat the meat. Allah Jalla wa Ala says about this sacrifice in Surah Al-Hajj, لَن يَنَالَ اللَّهَ لُحُومُهَا وَلَا دِمَاؤُهَا وَلَكِنْ يَنَالُهُ التَّقْوَى مِنْكُمْ. The meat and the blood does not reach Allah, but your taqwa reaches Allah. So this is the point about the sacrifice. It is an expression of your taqwa. So the aim is not to eat the meat, although that is permissible. And the aim is not to give gifts and charity from this meat, although that is permissible and ought to be done. But do not forget the main aim, which is an act of ibadah. It is a separate, independent act of ibadah. Having known this, are you now allowed to offer this sacrifice, the udhiyah sacrifice, for the deceased? Well, if we take a look at the sunnah of the Prophet, he did not do this, even though his uncle Hamza died on the battlefield at Uhud. His wife Khadija died. His son Ibrahim died. His wife Zainab bint Khuzaymah died. He did not offer the sacrifice of udhiyah for any one of these. So we know that this is not an intended sunnah. However, if a person sacrifices the udhiyah, intending it to be a sacrifice for himself, for his family members, including the deceased, then that is okay, because your actions are by your intention and you will have what you intend. But you do not make two sacrifices, one for the living, so for yourself and for your family, and another second sacrifice for deceased members of your family. No, that is wrong. The evidence that the udhiyah is not for the meat per se, but rather an independent act of ibadah, is the hadith of Abu Burda coming up, where the Prophet told him, "Sha'atuka sha'atu lahm." Your sheep is for the meat only. So note that you are not allowed to offer a sacrifice as an act of ibadah except with that which Allah has legislated, and these are three types: the udhiyah, which we're speaking about now. Also we have the hadiyah, which is the sacrifice you offer in the haram and give the meat to the poor. The Prophet ﷺ sacrificed 100 camels, 63 he did himself during his Hajjatul Wada', and the rest sacrificed by Ali, 100 camels in total. That is not an easy task. And then thirdly we have the aqiqah, which is when a child is born to you. These are three types of sacrifices in which the meat is not intended per se. Of course, the meat is going to be eaten, but it is not intended per se. Rather, they are a separate, independent act of ibadah. We take from the narration that the sacrificial animal would be taken to the place of the Eid prayer and sacrificed over there. And this serves a vital purpose, an open demonstration of an act of ibadah. Just like the Salat al-Eid itself, it's prayed out in the open. It's an open demonstration of an emblem of Islam. We take that if you sacrifice an animal before the Salat al-Eid because you did not know the ruling, then you are not sinful. However, the sacrifice still does not count, It's much like if you prayed before its proper time. The salah will not count, but you'll just have to pray it again. But you will not be sinful if you did not do this intentionally. If you sacrifice before the salah, then we have just discussed that you have to sacrifice again. But do you have to sacrifice a similar animal? The answer is yes. So you're not allowed to sacrifice an animal that is more deficient or of a lesser quality than the animal you sacrificed before the salah. Why? Because the Prophet said, فَلْيَذْبَحْ شَاةً مَكَانَهَا, and let him sacrifice a sheep in its place, that is, a similar sheep. Note also that even if we say that the udhiyah is sunnah mu'akkada, if you sacrifice before the salah, you have to, by way of obligation, sacrifice after the salah. So this sunnah mu'akkada now becomes a fard upon you. So you cannot say, oh well, it was sunnah anyway, so I will not bother sacrificing again after the salah, because the Prophet has given the order here, which denotes obligation. We find that you must sacrifice in the name of Allah. This is not specific to the udhiyah sacrifice, it is for all sacrifices. That is a condition for the sacrifice to be correct, is that you must sacrifice in the name of Allah. So you can say Bismillah, you can say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, or you can say Bismillahi Allahu Akbar. So in all of these you have mentioned the name of Allah, but at least a Bismillah, this should be the minimum. We also take from the hadith enjoining the good and forbidding the evil and spreading the knowledge when people need it, because clearly the Prophet saw a mistake had been made here, so he has to correct the people by making plain the ruling. And just another point about the udhiyah, there is a hadith in which it is mentioned that your udhiyah animal will be your ride, which you will ride on as you cross the sirat on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So let it be known that this hadith is extremely weak and not to be taken as evidence. Also in the chapter from Al-Bara bin Azib, he says that my maternal uncle, Abu Burda, sacrificed the udhiyah before the salah. And the Prophet said to him, Tilka shatu lahm. This is the sheep of meat. That is, a sheep sacrificed just so the meat can be eaten, that's it. And so Abu Burda says, O Messenger of Allah, I have a jad'a, which is a young goat. And the Prophet said, Dahi biha wa la tasluhu li ghayrik. Okay, sacrifice this, and it will not be right for anyone other than you to sacrifice it. And then the Prophet said, Man dhaha qabla as-salah fa innama dhabaha li nafsih. Whoever sacrifices before the salah, then he has sacrificed only for his own self. وَمَنْ ذَبَحَ بَعْدَ الصَّلَاةِ فَقَدْ تَمَّ نُسُكُهُ وَأَصَابَ سُنَّةَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. And whoever sacrifices after the salah, then his ritual of the sacrifice is complete, and he has attained or observed the sunnah of the Muslimin. So the Prophet allows him in this narration to sacrifice a jad'a, which is a 6-month-old goat. And he says this will not be proper for anyone other than you. And this needs to be understood properly, because there are no ahkam in the Sharia which are specific to any one individual personality. Why should Abu Burda radiallahu anh have a specific rule just for him? There is simply no reason. So when the Prophet says it is not right for anyone other than you, it means to say anyone other than in your situation. Most scholars say that this rule is specific to Abu Burda and it will not apply to anyone after Abu Burda. But it ought to be noted that the ahkam of the Sharia are to be understood by their meaning and description, not to be understood by the people they apply to. That is, there is no specific rule for any one individual personality. All rules are understood by their underlying meaning and description. What about specific rules for the Prophet, such as having 9 wives at the same time, and other than that? This is not because of his personality, but rather because of the description of prophethood. And so anyone who has a description of prophethood would have similar specific rules applied to him. So in conclusion we say, even if it is the minority opinion, that if a person finds himself in a similar situation to that of Abu Burda, that is, he has sacrificed an animal before the salah to feed himself and his family, and he did not know the ruling, then it becomes known to him that this is not a valid sacrifice, and he has with him only a jad'a, which is a 6-month-old goat, then he can offer that as a sacrifice. However, if his situation differs from that of Abu Burda, then the rule will be different. So for example, if he sacrificed before the salah, and then he found out the ruling, and he does not have a jad'a anymore, so here he does not need to sacrifice a jad'a, and we would not tell him to purchase a jad'a and sacrifice it. No, because his situation differs. Rather, we would tell him to purchase a normal goat, which is 1 year old, and sacrifice that. Okay, with regards to sacrificing the animal, you'll remember that it is an act of ibadah in which the taqwa is intended, just like any other act of ibadah, not the meat. Remember what the Prophet said to Abu Burda? Tilka shatu lahm. This is the sheep of meat, where the meat is just intended, like any other slaughter where you intend to eat the meat. And this is when he sacrificed it before the salah. So there's a difference then between the sheep which you slaughter simply for the meat and the udhiyah slaughtering, which is a sacrifice. Based upon this, you should sacrifice the animal yourself with your own hand because it is an act of ibadah. If you are able to do so, then you must. If you are not able to do so, then you must appoint somebody else who will do it for you. Just like performing the Hajj, you must do it yourself. But if you are unable to do it, due to an illness which you will not recover from, or due to old age, which you obviously will not recover from, then you appoint somebody else to do it for you. But if you appoint somebody else to do it for you, then it is better for you to be in the presence of the one sacrificing as he does so. This is the better way if you can manage it. So here's a question. We know that we're allowed to eat the sacrifice meat of the Yahud and Nasara as long as the conditions are met, in particular if they mention the name of Allah over the animal. So are we allowed to appoint a Yahudi or a Nasrani to sacrifice the udhiyah? The answer here is no. Why? Because this is an act of ibadah. Remember the difference between sacrificing an animal for meat and sacrificing an animal because it's an act of ibadah. An act of ibadah cannot be carried out by a Yahudi or a Nasrani. If you are unable to perform the Hajj, will you appoint a Yahudi or a Nasrani to perform it on your behalf? No? Well, it's the same ruling here. Why? Because it's an act of ibadah, as opposed to appointing a Nasrani or Yahudi to slaughter an animal for yourself in order to eat the meat. Then yes, you can, because that is not an act of ibadah in and of itself. So note this crucial difference. Let's move on to the next chapter about the age of the udhiyah animal. From Jabir, the Prophet said, لا تذبحوا إلا مسنة إلا أن يعصر عليكم فتذبحوا جذعة من الضأن. Do not slaughter except a musinna, that is the animal which has its front teeth growing, unless such an animal is difficult for you to find, in which case you can sacrifice a 6-month-old sheep. Some ulama said that you do not sacrifice until the Imam has sacrificed first. But what is correct is that you can sacrifice it at any time after the Salat al-Eid. That is the crucial point, as we found from the first set of hadith in the previous chapter. The musinna is 5 years for a camel, 2 years for a cow, and 1 completed year for a sheep. So you're not allowed to sacrifice anything less than that age. Okay, here's a question. Can you perform the aqiqah sacrifice and the udhiyah sacrifice with one and the same animal, so combining between the two acts of ibadah? Some scholars allowed this. However, an objection to this rule would be that both the aqiqah and the udhiyah serve 2 different purposes. And this is the question we need to ask ourselves when combining between 2 acts of ibadah. Do they serve the same purpose? If they do, then you can combine them. If they do not, you cannot combine them. For example, praying the sunnah of dhuhr and the tahiyatul masjid. The sunnah of the dhuhr, the purpose there is that you perform 2 rak'at before the dhuhr, a sunnah salah. And the tahiyatul masjid is simply that you perform 2 rak'at as you enter the masjid. And so with one set of 2 rak'at, both purposes are being served. Is this the case with the aqiqah and the udhiyah, with the same animal? Well, the purposes appear to be different. For the aqiqah, it is like a ransom you pay for the child. And for the udhiyah, it is an act of ibadah for the day of Eid. One could argue that these are 2 different purposes, and hence one animal would not suffice, because every act of ibadah, or every animal in this case, would have to be sacrificed for one purpose. But if there are 2 different purposes, then one animal will not suffice. So we say it is safer to sacrifice 2 different animals, one for each act of ibadah, even though some ulama do say that you can sacrifice one animal for both of the acts of ibadah. Okay, let's move to the next chapter about sacrificing with your own hands and not appointing a proxy. From Anas ibn Malik, he says that the Prophet sacrificed kabshain, 2 rams, amlahain, with white and black marks or colors, aqranain, with 2 horns. He recited the name of Allah, the tasmiyah, and also made takbir, Allahu Akbar. He says that the Prophet sacrificed it with his own hand, biyadihi, and he made tasmiyah, that's to say Bismillah, and he made takbir, which is to say Allahu Akbar. And he says that he put his foot on their sides while he was sacrificing them. We can easily take from this narration that you sacrifice the animal with your hand. You do not appoint a proxy if you are able to sacrifice yourself. Like we said, if you are not, then you can appoint a wakil or a proxy. But you really ought to witness the sacrifice, because that's the best that you can do if you cannot physically perform the sacrifice yourself. Note how Anas ibn Malik stresses this point that he ذَبَحَهُمَا بِيَدِهِ. He sacrificed them with his hands. Otherwise, how else do you sacrifice if it is not with your hands? But Anas ibn Malik is emphasizing this point. So we take from this that you sacrifice with your own hands and do not appoint a proxy. This is the better way. And when sacrificing, the Prophet said, Bismillahi wallahu akbar. He made tasmiyah and takbir. But the minimum is just to say Bismillah. Just the name of Allah Jalla wa Ala should be mentioned. And he put his foot on the side. This is so the animal does not get up because it is lying down. That's how you sacrifice a sheep or a cow. As for the camel, it is standing up. And the sacrifice there is called the nahar as opposed to a dhabh. He sacrificed a ram with 2 horns. This shows that it's strong. It's a good, healthy ram. Like we said before, when you offer Allah Jalla wa Ala something, you do not offer Him just the scraps. You would not offer this to any other human being whom you respected. So Allah Jalla wa Ala is more worthy of your veneration. So this is what we must choose, the best animal that we can find. Also, what about the color? The Prophet sacrificed 2 rams which were black and white colored. Should we also sacrifice this color? It seems to us that this color just happened to happen by chance, and it was not intended per se. We also take that making the takbir as you sacrifice is recommended but not obligatory. The obligation is Bismillah, as we find from the Quran, and also it is good practice, as we find in the narration, to put your foot on the side of the animal so it does not get back up, so you can sacrifice it more comfortably. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports, the Prophet commanded that a ram with black legs, a black belly, and blackness around the eyes should be brought to him and sacrificed. He said to Aisha, give me the large knife to sacrifice. She did so, and he said, sharpen it with a stone, and she did so. Then the Prophet sacrificed the ram, placing it on the ground, and the Prophet said, Bismillahi, Allahumma taqabbal min Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa min ummati Muhammad. In the name of Allah, O Allah, accept this from Muhammad and from the family of Muhammad and from the ummah of Muhammad. Again, from this narration we learn you sacrifice a ram or any other animal for that matter which is healthy and strong. Not just some cheap material that you are going to throw away anyway. As for the color, that is not so important. All colors are equal. One color does not denote superiority over another color. We find here that the Prophet asks Aisha for a large knife and then also asks her to sharpen it. 2 requests, so you can seek help from other human beings in that which they are able to do and they are present, that is, alive with you, even if not in the same country. We find that you must use a sharp knife. Remember the hadith about the ihsan in everything, that you must sharpen the knife. Was the knife being sharpened in front of the animal? Because remember we quoted the hadith where the Prophet said to a man sharpening his knife in front of the animal, أَتُرِيدُ أَن تُمِيتَهَا مَيْتَتَيْنِ? Do you want to give it 2 deaths? Well, in this hadith it is not clear. So we should go with the hadith which is clear and leave off that which is unclear. We also find that the takbir in sacrificing the animal is not obligatory. The Prophet did not do it here. We find in the narration the Prophet sacrificing this on behalf of his own self, on behalf of his family and the whole of his ummah. So he's doing his whole ummah a favor. Now just take note here that there is an opinion amongst some of the scholars that the udhiyah can be performed up till Muharram, meaning to say you've got the whole month of Dhul Hijjah to perform the udhiyah, and that the time does not finish at the end of the days of Tashriq. There is a mursal narration which Ibn Hazm quotes in his book Al-Muhalla, which says that the Prophet allowed the udhiyah sacrificed ila hilal al-Muharram, up to the crescent of the Muharram month, which is of course after Dhul Hijjah. Also, Abu Nu'aym has in his Mustakhraj that Abu Umama ibn Sahal, a major tabi'i, said that the Muslimun would purchase their udhiyah, fatten it up, and then sacrifice it at the end of Dhul Hijjah. So this opinion is a respect-worthy one. However, it is better to be on the safe side and to have it done during the days of at-tashriq. Okay, here's a question. Is it better to sacrifice a male or a female animal? Here we simply have a difference of opinion, and each give their reasons. Some say male, others say female, and some say it is all the same. The matter does not appear to be too critical. Whatever is easy for you to do, do it. Also, it should be noted that the reward of the udhiyah can be dedicated to as many people as you like, as the Prophet is doing here for the whole of his ummah. However, when it comes to the ijza, which is the responsibility being discharged, then this can only be for a man and his household members. We have evidence in the Sunan of Tirmidhi, where Abu Musa al-Ansari radiallahu anhu said that a man would sacrifice a sheep for himself and for his family. They would eat and give it to others to feed them until the people started becoming extravagant and competing with each other, as you see now. So what we say is that one sheep suffices the whole family. And the Prophet did not order his wives to sacrifice any animal. Rather, he did it on their behalf. So a man can do it on behalf of his household members. So those people who are regularly living in his house. Also, can you sacrifice more than one animal? The answer is yes. In fact, sacrificing more means more act of ibadah. But this needs to be on the condition that you're not boasting and competing with others, as if to say, oh look, I can sacrifice more than you can. Okay, what if someone intentionally does not perform the sacrifice until the time expires? We say he has to do nothing except repent. And this is the weightier opinion, because if you do something deliberately outside of its time, then its presence is like its absence, because as the hadith tells us, it is mardud or rad, meaning rejected. But as for if you forgot or had a genuine excuse, then it can be made up for after the time expires. We move to the next chapter about slaughtering the animal with anything that will make the blood flow, except for the tooth and a nail, and all types of bones. From Rafi' bin Khadij radiallahu anhu, he says that I said to the Prophet, O Messenger of Allah, we are going to meet the enemy tomorrow and we have no knives. Thereupon the Prophet said, make haste or be careful in making arrangements. ما أنهر الدم وذكر اسم الله فقل ليس السن والظفر وسأحدثك أما السن فعظم وأما الظفر فمدى الحبشة. Whatever makes the blood flow and the name of Allah is mentioned, then eat it. Only you're not allowed to sacrifice with tooth or nail. And I'll explain this to you. As for the tooth, then it is a type of bone. And as for the nail, then this is the slaughtering knives of the Habasha, the Abyssinians. Rafi' says, we obtained as spoils of war some camel and goats. And one of the camel became wild and ran away. Thereupon one of the people threw his arrow and caught it. To which the Prophet commented, إِنَّ لِهَذِهِ الْإِبِلِ أَوَابِدَ كَأَوَابِدِ الْوُحْشِ فَإِذَا غَلَبَكُمْ مِنْهَا شَيْءٌ فَاصْنَعُوا بِهِ هَكَذَا. These camels have a wild nature, just like wild animals. So if you find an animal getting wild, then do just as was done with it. That is to say, you can throw your spear or arrow and catch it. From this vital hadith we learn two conditions for the slaughter. The blood must flow, so you must cut the jugular vein if you are slaughtering it. So the knife obviously needs to be sharp, but you're not allowed to use a tooth or a nail. And the generality of the hadith means that any tooth or nail, be it a human one or an animal's tooth or nail. The tooth is a type of bone, and it is impermissible to sacrifice with a bone, even if the bone is sharp. And the reason is, if you take a bone and sacrifice with this bone, then obviously it comes from some sort of body, let's say a bone from an animal. Either this animal is slaughtered in a halal fashion, then the bone is food from the Muslims of the jinn. So if you use it to sacrifice an animal, then you're going to spoil their food for them. And just like you wouldn't want anyone to spoil your food, so you do not spoil others' food. As for if this animal is not sacrificed properly, then this bone will be najis and not fit to slaughter the animal. So how can you use something impure to make the animal pure? Because when you sacrifice in a halal way, you make the animal pure and good enough to eat. How can you do that using an impure instrument? And as for the nails, then this is what the Abyssinians would use to slaughter their animals. So what would happen is that these Habasha would grow their nails long so they can use that to slaughter the animal. and the Prophet did not want us to do the same thing. So essentially their nails would become like knives, that's how long and sharp they would become. And your nails, moustache, armpit and pubic hair should not be left for more than 40 days before cutting them. Otherwise, we say that if there is a particular knife that the Habasha use, it's a normal knife, then we are allowed to use that knife also. There's no danger in that. The danger is in growing your nails long. This is the point. Note that the hadith says, "Ma anharatam," whatever makes the blood flow. Somebody might say, yes, but you can stab the animal anywhere and the blood will flow. It does not have to be the jugular veins. We say no, the blood will flow if the jugular vein is cut. If you stab the animal somewhere else, yes, of course, blood will exit, but it will not flow as copiously. The idea is that we want to make the blood flow copiously because the blood is what is making the animal najis, and we want to drain that as much as possible. And we say, in opposition to other opinions, that it is not enough to cut the airways or the pipe for the food. Rather, it is the jugular vein that needs to be cut. Both is better, but at least one. Also note, in the Sunan of Abi Dawud, the Prophet forbade the sharitatu shaitan, that the neck is cut during the slaughter, but the jugular veins are not cut. So the minimum is to cut one jugular vein. It is better, however, to cut both of them. This would be faster for the death of the animal. If you cut both the jugular veins and the airways and the food pipe, all four of them, then this is fine as well. It is the best way, because it will be quicker for the animal's death. We also learn that the camels do have a wild nature which can kick in sometimes. If that happens, then the camel could be treated as a game animal, in which case you can throw your spear or arrow, and however you catch it will be good enough as long as it pierces the animal and makes the blood flow. So during a game animal catch, we are more flexible. It does not have to be cutting the jugular vein, because it is far more difficult to do that. So the Sharia provides some flexibility in this matter. Slaughtering with bones, are there any exceptions? Well, the answer is because the Prophet has not made any exceptions, and in the hadith, the reason as to why we are not allowed to use the bone is not made clear. Yes, it is true, we gave the reason, but this is because some scholars suggested that this is the reason, the one we have just given. Otherwise, the ultimate reason is because the Prophet forbade sacrificing with any type of bone. This is the reason why it is haram, because the Prophet forbade it. That's enough for us. It is never a condition that we understand the illah or the justification before we implement the ruling. Here's a question. Is it permissible to slaughter the animal with a silver or gold knife? Because we know the Prophet forbade eating and drinking from silver and gold vessels for both men and women of the Muslimin. Or we say, because he forbade eating and drinking, it would suggest that anything other than that is permissible, which would include slaughtering an animal with a silver or gold knife. It is not permissible to do this to show off or to feel proud or high and mighty, but if you're just doing it because you happen to have a gold or a silver knife, then we feel that there is nothing much wrong with it, because you're not using gold and silver to eat and drink from. And we know Salama had a silver bell in which she had some of the hair strands of the Prophet, and she would put water on it and give it to sick people to heal them thereby, because you're allowed to use the effects of the Prophet, such as his hair strands, to seek benefit and blessing from, and healing as well. So there she is using a silver vessel, not for eating and drinking, but for another purpose, which is to heal the sick. Another question, is it allowed to use a stolen or usurped knife to slaughter the animal? The answer is that the slaughter itself will be halal. In other words, the animal meat will be halal, but it is haram to use this knife to slaughter or for any other purpose. The only action which you must perform is to return that knife. Any other action you perform with that knife will be haram. Even cutting cucumber or fruit or something as innocuous as that would be haram. The next chapter. It was impermissible to leave the udhiyah meat for more than 3 days, but now this ruling is abrogated. The statement of Ali ibn Abi Talib, he said that the Prophet forbade us to eat the meat of the udhiyah beyond 3 days. Also from Salama ibn al-Aqwa, that the Prophet said, "Man ضحى منكم فلا يصبحن في بيته بعد ثالثة شيئا." Whoever sacrifices the udhiyah, he should have nothing of its meat left after 3 days. So when the next year came, they asked the Prophet, should we do the same as you ordered last year? He said, لا إن ذاك عام كان الناس فيه بجهد فأردت أن يفشو فيهم. He said, no, that last year was a year where people were hard pressed because of their poverty, so I wanted that the meat be distributed amongst them. And so we find from the narration, this is the reason why the Prophet said, do not have anything remaining after 3 days. So this would encourage people to distribute their meat to the poor. Note also from the narration that in the first year, the Prophet simply gave the command, do not have anything of the meat of your sacrificed animal after 3 days. He did not actually give the reason why, but the next year he gave the reason. When the inquiry was made, should we repeat as we did last time? And then the Prophet gave the reason as to why he gave that ruling last year. Because last year people were hard pressed due to their poverty, so I wanted the meat to be distributed amongst them. So it goes to show that there is no problem in trying to find the illah for a ruling. And therefore there is no problem in seeking a qiyas or an analogy because of the illah which you find in a ruling. Also from Abdullah ibn Buraidah, the Prophet said, نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ فَزُورُوهَا. I prohibited you from visiting the graves, but now you may visit them. وَنَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ لُحُومِ الْأَضَاحِي فَوْقَ ثَلَاثٍ فَأَمْسِكُوا مَا بَدَا لَكُمْ. I used to forbid you from keeping the udhiyah meat beyond 3 days, but now you may keep it as long as you want to. Or we could say store it for as long as you want to. And he says, وَنَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنِ النَّبِيذِ إِلَّا فِي سِقَاءٍ فَاشْرَبُوا فِي الْأَسْقِيَةِ كُلِّهَا وَلَا تَشْرَبُوا مُسْكِرًا. And I prohibited you from drinking nabidh except those that were prepared in water skin. Now you may prepare the nabidh in any utensil, but do not drink an intoxicant. This hadith is a premier hadith to prove that a naskh or an abrogation can happen in the Sharia. In this one hadith we have 3 examples of naskh, of abrogation. The first one, he prohibited visiting graves, because graveyards are a spiky issue. It is where shirk can emanate from. And when the Muslims are first entering Islam, they could be tempted to worship the grave. So the Prophet wants to have the iman firmly rooted in their hearts. After it is firmly rooted, they can visit graves because the fear of shirk is now minimal. So you see the ruling is abrogated. The generality of this hadith permits men and women to visit graves, and this is the majority opinion, as long as we can be safe that there will be no fitna if women visit graves in terms of letting their emotions loose and wailing and slapping their cheek and just generally expressing a lack of patience. The other and safer opinion is that women do not visit graves. Also, the prohibition of meat beyond 3 days, we have already given the reason as to why the Prophet forbade that. And then thirdly, we have this prohibition of the nabidh, which is a type of drink often made from dates, but it can turn intoxicant. And the Prophet forbade nabidh to be made in those containers in which intoxicants are normally made, out of fear that the Muslims will start to make intoxicants. And again, the Muslims are newly entering Islam. There is a fear that they will fall into the ways of the Jahiliyyah and start making intoxicants. So to cut off any roots, the Prophet said you may make nabidh only in dried water skins, because in dried water skins, khamr was not made, but it was made in other types of utensils. In the dried water skins, it takes a longer time for water and dates or water and grapes, which is nabidh, to ferment and become an intoxicant. Whereas other utensils of copper or vessel or clay, it ferments a lot quicker. And so the danger was, for the new Muslims, is that it will ferment and they will start drinking khamr. But afterwards, when the iman firmly sets in and there is very little danger that the Muslims generally will start to drink khamr, the Prophet allowed nabidh to be made in any utensil. Because even if it then ferments and becomes khamr or intoxicant, the Muslim with his stronger iman now will not drink it. We can also learn a vital lesson that for a new Muslim who enters Islam, we need to be gentle and build up his iman. It's like the Prophet is doing here with the Sahaba. If the Sahaba need their iman to be built up step by step, then what about a new Muslim in this day and age? Even more care needs to be taken with such a person. Otherwise, as happens all too frequently, they'll just end up leaving Islam because they will not be able to cope with it, as they did not have any support. We are also told in these narrations that with the udhiyah meat, you eat from it, you give it as a gift, and you give it as a charity. It does not have to be a third each, but all of these actions are recommended. Okay, the next chapter about the far' and atira. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, La far'a wa la atira. There is no far' and there is no atira. So what is this far'? Different tafasir are given. Let us make mention of what An-Nawawi says. So he says that some scholars said that the far' is if your camel gives birth to the first child, they would sacrifice the child in the hope that this camel would be blessed and give more children. A second tafsir is that they would sacrifice the first child of their camel to their idols, seeking blessing thereby. Another tafsir is that if a person has 100 camels, so his count reaches 100, then the first child born after he has 100 camels, he would sacrifice that child, meaning the first child of the camel, after his number of camels reach 100. So these are three opinions on the matter. As for the atira, then there's an agreement as to what that is. They would, in the time of Jahiliyyah, sacrifice a camel in the first 10 days of the month of Rajab, and hence the atira would also be called the Rajabiyya. So this was a ritual of theirs, and so the Prophet ﷺ is saying that these are not rituals in Islam, such that people think that they were rituals in Jahiliyyah, and they are also rituals in Islam. In the same way the udhiyah sacrifice is a ritual in Islam. So no, rather you can slaughter the animal during any month, and you do not sacrifice to the idols. The next chapter, anyone who wants to sacrifice the animal should not take anything of his own hair or nails, that is to say, cut any of it. From Salama, إذا رأيتم هلال ذي الحجة وأراد أحدكم أن يضحي فليمسك عن شعره وأظفاره. When you people see the hilal of Dhul Hijjah, and one of you wants to make the sacrifice, the udhiyah sacrifice, then let him keep away from cutting his hair or nail. The nails here are the fingernails and the nails on the foot. As for the hair, it is all types of hair, on the head, armpit, pubic hair, moustache, and just any type of hair. Why is this? Well, it has been said to leave them whole so that more of you is freed from the fire. And it is also said that you resemble in certain aspects a muhrim. And Allah knows best, but sufficient for us is this hadith to go by. In another narration it says, حَتَّى يُضَحِيَ, until he sacrifices the animal. So you need to withhold from taking any of your hair or nail until the animal is sacrificed. This may even be during the ayyam al-tashriq. And the next chapter, the curse of the one who sacrifices for anyone besides Allah. Abu Tufail reports, we said to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and this was the time when he was the Khalifa, inform us that which the Prophet told you in secret. And Ali replied that the Prophet never told me anything in secret, but I heard him say, لَعَنَ اللَّهُ مَنْ ذَبَحَ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ. Allah curses the one who sacrifices for other than Allah. وَلَعَنَ اللَّهُ مَنْ آوَى مُحْدِثًا. And Allah curses the one who gives shelter or accommodates an innovator. وَلَعَنَ اللَّهُ مَنْ لَعَنَ وَالِدَيْهِ. And Allah curses the one who curses his own parents. وَلَعَنَ اللَّهُ مَنْ غَيَّرَ مَنَارَ الْأَرْضِ. And Allah curses the one who changes the boundaries of the land. Sacrificing for other than Allah Jalla wa Ala is not just haram, it is shirk. Shirk akbar. For the one who sacrifices, gaining a closeness to other than Allah. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ وَبِذَلِكَ أُمِرْتُ وَأَنَا أَوَّلُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. And my salah, my sacrificing, and my living and my dying are for Allah, the Rabbul Alameen. He does not have a partner. And this is what I have been commanded to do, and I am the first of the Muslimin. That is the Muslimin of this ummah. Likewise, فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ. And pray for your Rabb and make the nahar, that is the sacrifice for your Rabb. So these are actions solely for Allah Jalla wa Ala, just like the salah and any other act of ibadah. And the dhabiha, if done for other than Allah, is haram. As he tells us, وَمَا أُهِلَّ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ بِهِ. And whatever is sacrificed for other than Allah, likewise he says, وَمَا ذُبِحَ عَلَى النُّصُبِ. Whatever is sacrificed on the raised stone altars for the idols. However, a question here would be, what if a guest comes to your house and you slaughter an animal for the guest, that is, to feed him? Well, if this is done as an honoring for the guest, so that the guest may be able to eat the meat, then this is fine, it's not an act of ibadah, as long as the slaughter is done in the name of Allah. And that this slaughter is not an act of ibadah, you're not doing it to gain a closeness and to venerate someone who is worshipped, as the mushrikeen would do for their idols. We learn a vital lesson from this hadith, that the Prophet did not give to Ali ibn Abi Talib something secret. Because during his time, there were rumors going around that the Prophet secretly told him that he should be the Khalifa and not Abu Bakr. And we find in one of the narrations that Ali actually became angry at this question, because it is not for the Prophet to secretly give somebody some knowledge to the exclusion of others. This is not what prophets do. any knowledge which is beneficial to the ummah, the prophets will publicly display it. The prophets could tell some secrets, but this does not pertain to the general benefit of the ummah, such as the prophet secretly giving Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman the names of the munafiqeen. But this does not benefit the rest of the ummah, because if the rest of the ummah find out about the names, this could cause fitna. So some things you have to keep secret for the general welfare of the people. However, matter of the Khilafah is a matter that affects the general populace. And Ali narrates a hadith then, that the Prophet said that Allah curses the one who curses his parents. This could be understood in two ways. Either the Prophet is giving some information here, that is to say, a declarative statement that Allah curses the one who curses his parents, or it could mean that the Prophet is making dua, that may Allah curse those who curse their parents. So either a person may directly curse their parents, or it could be that he curses another person's parents and that other person curses his parents back. So the first person was the cause for his own parents to be cursed, and this takes the same ruling. It is as if you have cursed your own parents. However, it needs to be noted that if somebody curses your parents or insults your parents, you should not insult his parents back, because his parents did not do any wrong to you. Rather, at most, you have the right to insult him back, the one who is insulting your parents. But do not insult his parents back, they are innocent. Some scholars would say that you are allowed to curse their parents back, because Allah says, وَجِزَاءُ سَيِّئَةٍ سَيِّئَةٌ مِثْلُهَا, and the reward, the recompense of an evil is an evil like thereof. However, we feel that the first opinion is stronger, because even though you're allowed to retaliate, but your retaliation must not transgress against other people. And hence this ayah should be understood on a one-to-one level, where a third person is not involved. However, even in a one-to-one situation, there are still some exceptions. What if somebody accuses you of being a zani, a fornicator? This is qadhaf, which carries 80 stripes if you cannot produce witnesses. Can you then accuse him back of being a zani? The answer is no, because like we said, this is qadhaf. Certainly you can insult him back, but not qadhaf, because this is a very specific statement which carries 80 lashes if you cannot produce witnesses. We have to be careful with these matters. Same way if somebody accuses you of being a sodomite, and then you accuse him of being a sodomite. Again, this is qadhaf. Certainly if you want, you can insult him back, but not with qadhaf. Like we say, this is a very specific situation. Also, we learn that Allah curses the one who gives shelter to an innovator. So this is the type of person who will defend an innovator and would support him, and perhaps if this innovator gets taken to a qadi to be judged, this person will intercede for him. And these types of matters, anything similar to that. Such a person is cursed because he's helping the innovator in his innovation and spreading the innovation. And similar to that is anyone who commits sins for which he should be punished, and then he seeks shelter with somebody, and that person gives him shelter, then this person granting shelter is also cursed. Also the one who changes the boundaries of the land. And this is if you want to usurp some land, you change the boundary so you gain more land. We all know of the hadith, whoever usurps a handspan of land would have 7 layers of earth tied around his neck. We seek Allah's forgiveness and protection. Now just another point of benefit here. The hukum revolves around the illah, as we know. If the illah returns, so does the hukum. So therefore, we may say that if we are living during times when there is hardship and people are hungry, then we would say that you are not allowed to keep the meat of the udhiyah for more than 3 days. Rather, you should eat it and give it to others to eat, so as to reduce the hunger during the days of Eid. Therefore, we may argue that the 3 days for the meat is not abrogated. Rather, the ruling revolves around the illah. Because if we said it was abrogated, then it would mean that we are always and ever onwards permitted to keep the meat for as long as we want. Whereas in reality, the better opinion to hold is that this is not the case. Rather, when there is a time of hunger, then you must share the meat out and let it not be kept with you for more than 3 days. Also, it should be noted that we have narrations which indeed allow al-far' and al-atira, which we explained before. And the way to reconcile this would be to say that there is no problem in sacrificing the first camel which is born to you, or sacrificing in Rajab, as long as it is done for Allah Jalla wa Ala and not how the Jahiliyyah did it for their idols. And also one is not allowed to think that Rajab is a special month for sacrifice. Rather, you may sacrifice in Rajab, but also any other month. There's nothing particularly special about Rajab. As for the people of Jahiliyyah, they used to hold Rajab as a special month. Also, with regards to not cutting off your nails and your hair when you are offering the sacrifice, we should also point out that skin is mentioned as well in some narrations. You're not allowed to take anything of your skin. The word is bashara, which is used. Also, we need to point out the ruling of removing your hair, nails and skin. The ruling is that it is haram to do so because of the forbiddance. But there is no fidya, just repentance. Okay, that concludes the chapter of Adaahi. Let's take some review questions. So question number 1. What is al-udhiyah? Question number 2. What are the conditions for its validity? Question number 3. For whom does the udhiyah suffice?